June 1943, Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. As the first groups of German POWs stepped off the transport ships, the air carried a smell they had not known in years. The heavy mix of oil, steel, and coal smoke, the scent of an industrial engine running at full speed. Many of the men, veterans of the Afrika Korps and the Atlantic convoys, carried secret doubts scribbled in diaries they dared not share aloud. Those doubts flared into open disbelief the moment their boots touched American soil. Before them stretched docks that seemed to have no end, illuminated not by the dim lamps of wartime Europe but by towering electric floodlights that turned night into day. Giant cranes moved with practiced rhythm, lifting crates the size of small houses as if they weighed nothing. Liberty ships lined the berths, arriving and departing in a constant procession, their holds stuffed with supplies flowing across two oceans. Prisoners later admitted they had been told America was weak, disorganized, on the brink of collapse under its own chaos. But here, at Norfolk, they saw a nation not only alive but accelerating. A single day's cargo unloaded at this one base equaled the weekly capacity of Hamburg. Lines of trucks snaked away from the waterfront, headlights cutting through the dusk in endless rows. To German eyes accustomed to rationing, shortages, and blackouts, the abundance bordered on the surreal. It was like stepping into another world. One diary confessed, a world where nothing seemed to run out. Their march to the waiting trains only deepened the shock. Instead of open cattle cars or wooden wagons, they were led into passenger coaches, seats cushioned, windows clear, even ceiling fans humming overhead. Some carriages carried the Pullman insignia, a name many recognized from American magazines they had once dismissed as propaganda. When the guards mentioned that air conditioning had been installed but was temporarily out of order, the prisoners exchanged glances of astonishment. In Europe, only grand hotels and government ministries knew such luxuries. Here it was routine transport for captured enemy soldiers. Through the windows, more revelations unfolded. Parking lots stretched beside the docks, filled with rows upon rows of civilian automobiles. Not trucks requisitioned for war, not staff cars for party elites, but ordinary sedans owned by dockworkers and clerks. The promise of the Volkswagen, once trumpeted as Hitler's people's car, had produced little more than show models and broken dreams. In Germany, most families counted themselves lucky to own a bicycle. Yet in Virginia, longshoremen earning modest wages drove to work, parked their cars casually, and thought nothing of it. A corporal muttered to his comrade, "If this is poverty, then what is our Reich?" That first evening on American soil was enough to plant a seed of unease that no amount of Nazi indoctrination could smother. Norfolk had revealed a truth too vast to ignore. The enemy's strength was not in words or slogans, but in steel, light, and motion. And the journey inland, deeper into the beating heart of the United States, would only magnify the shock. The train clattered westward through the humid Virginia night, its wheels echoing against the rails like a steady drumbeat. For the German prisoners seated by the windows, the passing landscape became a silent lecture in American power. Small towns appeared one after another, their streets glowing with neon signs and street lamps, light pouring casually from shop fronts and homes. It was a sight that left them whispering in disbelief. Germany had been under blackout for years. Entire cities plunged into darkness at sunset to hide from Allied bombers. Here, electricity seemed endless, treated with the same ease as air. One soldier later wrote, "We passed through 20 towns in a single night. Each had more light than all of Hamburg." During brief stops, the prisoners caught glimpses of life outside the camps to be. Families strolled sidewalks eating ice cream. Teenagers loitered in front of movie theaters, and cars. More cars than they had ever seen in one place, crowded every street. Some POWs muttered that it must be staged, a performance for their benefit. But the sheer casualness of it all, the way civilians barely noticed the trains passing, made such explanations collapse quickly. This was not theater. This was ordinary America. The railway yards were perhaps the most humbling. At one junction, coal chutes and water towers operated with mechanical precision, servicing locomotives at speeds the Germans could hardly believe. Machines scooped and poured with little human effort, while workers leaned against fences smoking American cigarettes, chatting idly as though nothing remarkable was happening. A sergeant from Cologne scribbled in his notebook that the yard consumed more electricity in a single hour than his entire district at home in a day. The casual waste astonished him. Half-finished bottles of Coca-Cola tossed away, paper cups discarded after a single use. In the Reich, such items would have been hoarded, reused, or traded. Here, they were nothing more than trash. As the trains rolled deeper inland, the prisoners began to see the beating heart of American industry. The silhouettes of massive plants loomed against the horizon, their smokestacks glowing red at night. In one passage through Ohio, the men counted furnaces that seemed to stretch on forever, lighting the sky like artificial dawn. At another stop, they saw barges on the river stacked high with wheat, coal, and ore, quantities that dwarfed the output of entire German provinces. One diary entry captured the growing realization. We were told America was rich. We were not told it was this rich. Perhaps most shattering of all was the sense that none of this was being hidden. Guards did not try to impress the prisoners. They merely did their jobs, treating the men with indifference rather than cruelty. To the POWs, this lack of theater carried its own weight. The America they saw through the glass was not a showpiece for foreign eyes. It was daily life, functioning effortlessly at a level that their homeland could not approach even in its proudest propaganda. By the time the trains approached the interior, the disbelief had shifted into something heavier. Each passing mile seemed to widen the gulf between Nazi promises and American reality. They had only just glimpsed the surface, yet already many felt a gnawing certainty. If this was the enemy's ordinary landscape, then the war they fought was already lost. The journey ended not in crumbling barracks or makeshift pens, but in camps that seemed closer to small towns than prisons. As the German POWs stepped off the trains into the Midwest and South, they braced for mud, overcrowding, and hunger. Instead, they found rows of wooden barracks, each wired with electric lights that burned late into the night. Showers with hot water hissed in long-tiled rooms, while flush toilets stood ready in numbers that outmatched entire villages back home. For men who had marched across North Africa under blistering heat, living for weeks without bathing, the simple act of standing under steaming water felt surreal. One corporal admitted in his diary, "We prisoners live cleaner here than officers in the field." Meals were another shock. Kitchens served beef, chicken, potatoes, fresh bread, and milk, often in portions so large that guards encouraged them to eat more. Regulations required the food to equal the standard U.S. Army ration, meaning prisoners ate better than many German civilians and even some frontline soldiers. The surplus was astonishing. Crates of fruit unloaded weekly, vegetables served with butter, eggs cooked by the dozen. And because American supply lines were so abundant, leftovers were discarded daily. A Munich hotel chef conscripted into the Wehrmacht confessed that he cried the first time he threw away loaves of untouched bread. "In Germany," he wrote, "such waste would have fed a family for weeks." The camp hospitals stunned even the most cynical. White-walled buildings stood stocked with medicines that German doctors had not seen in years. X-ray machines, modern surgical tables, and shelves of antibiotics waited for use. When word spread that penicillin, a drug still almost unknown in Europe, was being given freely even to prisoners with minor infections, disbelief turned to awe. A wounded sergeant who had carried a festering leg wound since Tunisia found himself healed in days. "The Americans saved their enemies with miracles," he wrote. For officers raised on the idea of Allied brutality, such experiences quietly unraveled years of indoctrination. Even the rules of camp life chipped away at Nazi certainties. Prisoners were allowed to organize choirs, soccer matches, and theater groups. Some camps ran their own newsletters, printed with American permission but written entirely by Germans. What began with defiant slogans and veiled propaganda soon shifted toward curiosity about the new world surrounding them. Subtle psychological work by the U.S. Special Projects Division encouraged this change, slipping in books, newspapers, and English lessons. Guards did not sermonize. They simply let America's abundance and efficiency speak for itself. Perhaps the most disorienting detail was how little attention the camps attracted. Locals drove by in their cars, sometimes stopping to watch a soccer game through the fences before heading home to dinner. No one seemed afraid of the prisoners. The war raged across Europe and the Pacific, yet here, behind barbed wire, life carried on with an ease that mocked every speech they had heard about American collapse. One lieutenant admitted privately, "If this is captivity, then our freedom in Germany is poorer than their prison."
The walls of the camps contained them, but they could not contain the steady erosion of faith. Already the POWs sensed that the next revelation would lie beyond those fences, in the fields and factories where they were soon to be sent. What they had witnessed inside was enough to shake their confidence. What awaited them outside promised to dismantle it entirely. When the gates finally opened for labor assignments, the destruction of illusions quickened. Groups of POWs boarded trucks each morning, not bound for punishment details, but for America's fields and factories. The first shock was the landscape itself. As the vehicles rolled through the countryside, they passed endless rows of corn, wheat, and cotton, fields so vast they seemed to stretch into the horizon. German soldiers, who had grown up in villages where plots were measured in acres, stared in disbelief at machines that did in an hour what their fathers had done in a week. A single combine harvester, roaring across the plains, devoured entire fields in a mechanical sweep. One Bavarian farmer's son admitted in his diary, "This machine equals 100 men, and here it is ordinary." Factories brought even deeper astonishment. POWs assigned to food processing plants, textile mills, or lumber yards entered facilities bristling with conveyor belts, steam boilers, and electric controls. Women and older men worked the machines, many of them sipping coffee or listening to radios, while production soared beyond anything Germany's largest plants could achieve. At a Campbell's soup cannery, prisoners watched tomatoes become thousands of canned meals in a single day. An older American woman monitored a control panel that, by German standards, would have required 50 trained men. "This was no propaganda," wrote a captured infantry sergeant, "but ordinary life, run by women whose sons were away fighting." What unsettled the POWs most was not only the scale, but the casualness of it all. Workers smoked cigarettes they rarely finished, tossed sandwiches half-eaten, and walked home to parking lots filled with cars. In Germany, even officers prized fuel like treasure. Here, the average laborer owned an automobile, sometimes two. A young prisoner assigned to unload coal near Detroit asked an American guard how many cars he had seen in the lot. "These?" the guard replied, shrugging. "Just the day shift." For the German, it was unthinkable. In Hamburg, cars were the privilege of party officials. In Detroit, factory workers drove to lunch in them. Agricultural assignments delivered equal blows to Nazi propaganda. In Texas, prisoners saw black and white laborers working side by side in cotton fields, eating boxed lunches larger than German rations for a week. At midday, they rested under shade while POWs, too, were offered sandwiches and cold water. The farmers themselves seemed unremarkable. Not aristocrats or party elites, just men in overalls who owned land, trucks, tractors, and homes with electricity. "Here," one Unteroffizier marveled, "a farmer lives better than a German officer." And always, the electricity. Everywhere the prisoners went, from barns to grain elevators to small-town shops, the lights burned freely, fans turned even in empty rooms, and machines hummed through the night. For engineers among them, the waste was incomprehensible. One Siemens technician calculated that a single American railway yard used more power in one day than his entire Berlin district in a week. "They waste what we cannot even dream to produce," he wrote bitterly. The POWs realized slowly that they were not seeing America's showpiece, not propaganda displays meant to impress, but ordinary life. They were permitted to look too freely, to see too much for it to be staged. Day by day, the contrast gnawed at them. Their homeland where blackout curtains smothered every light, where hunger and scarcity defined survival, and this new land where abundance was casual, mechanized, and seemingly limitless. By late 1943, intelligence officers began noting a shift in the camps. The fiercest believers no longer argued when statistics were shown. Many stopped talking of victory at all. One American officer wrote that the prisoners had entered a quiet collapse of faith, a recognition that the Reich had sent them into battle armed with lies. And still, they had not yet seen the full measure of American power. That revelation came as the trains carried them deeper inland, past factories so large they dwarfed entire German cities, into the heart of an industrial machine that seemed unstoppable. By the time the trains rumbled into the American Midwest, the steady dismantling of illusions reached its climax. Through the wide Pullman windows, German POWs stared at factories, so immense they seemed to swallow entire towns. In Detroit, the Willow Run plant stretched across the horizon, its assembly lines producing a B-24 bomber every hour. Prisoners pressed their faces to the glass, counting the aircraft rising from hangars, each one gleaming with precision. They had been told American machines were crude, hastily built, destined to fail in combat. Yet here was industrial choreography that rivaled anything they had imagined, bombers rolling from a factory floor with the precision of a clock. The scale was staggering, but what unsettled them most was the speed. In Louisville, synthetic rubber plants, built in only 18 months, now produced more in a year than Germany had managed since the war began. In Tennessee, an aluminum smelter glowed like a man-made sun, consuming more electricity than entire German cities. And along the Mississippi, barges loaded with grain stacked higher than buildings carried a harvest larger than the Reich could hope to gather in years of labor. "The Americans move food as if it were ammunition," wrote a young corporal, "and there is no end to it." Even the casual infrastructure shocked them. Bridges of steel stretched across mighty rivers, highways glimmered under electric lamps, freight trains longer than any in Europe rolled past,